On January 15, 1967, the first ever Super Bowl was held between the Green Bay Packers and the Kansas City Chiefs. Even though the game wasn't known as the Super Bowl by this point, it would evolve tremendously over time into the spectacle that it is today. From the beginning, the Super Bowl was held at a neutral site, and it still is like this today. And with everything that goes on with the Super Bowl, could you imagine if it was held at the higher seed, and the host city had virtually no time to prep? It would be a nightmare. The Super Bowl has always been at a neutral site, and barring something highly unforeseen, will continue to be played at neutral sites. But every other game in the postseason, that's held at the higher seed. It doesn't matter how warm or how cold that city is. The game is held at the team that's ranked higher in the bracket. For some of these playoff games, the weather isn't a factor, as the game is played in a dome or it's played in a warm weather city. For others, though, you get brutally cold games. You get games where referees aren't able to blow their whistle. You get games where kicking the football is almost impossible. You get games where the coach looks like they can die at any minute. What if these playoff games were held at neutral sites? What if you played the AFC and the NFC Championship at a neutral site? Turns out, this was a legitimate possibility back in the 1980s. This almost happened. Over 40 years ago, the competition committee proposed something so radical that would have altered the future of NFL history forever. They proposed that the conference championships get played at neutral sites, much like the Super Bowl, and be played exclusively in warm weather cities or dome stadiums. And this is the story of how that almost happened. How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where the league seriously considered playing the conference championship games in a neutral site? The article that I found was written on January 29, 1982. In the previous 12 months, there were two very notable instances of brutally cold games. The first is the infamous game from the 1980-81 postseason known as Red Right 88. Sometime within the next week, I'm hoping to get a video out about that game and the infamous decision at the end of it. So be sure to subscribe and stay notified so you don't miss when that goes up. Now, this playoff game between the Browns and the Raiders was played in temperatures of 2 degrees, with wind speeds of 21 miles per hour and a wind chill factor of -20 under the current formula. Players were sliding and falling down on the grass, as it was like playing on a sheet of ice. Safety Mike Davis said that it was so cold that you could lick Gatorade off of a stick. And Al Davis said that it was so cold that it was like fighting the Russians in Moscow. And the second game in the span was the Freezer Bowl. I made a Dumb Decisions video about that if you want to check that out in the upper right corner. Now, this game between the Chargers and the Bengals was played in extremely cold conditions, to the point where Riverfront Stadium was only about 80% full. Under the old wind chill factor formula, it was -59 degrees. Neither team could punt or kick the football. It was like kicking a rock that was super glued onto a brick. Okay, so these games were cold and produced less than ideal conditions. So what's the big deal? Well, there were quite a few owners, including Cowboys president Tex Schramm, who did not like this one bit. He did not like the postseason, and a team's chances at winning the Super Bowl was being decided by weather conditions. For a few years, he was a proponent of neutral site conference championships. And now that these two data points occurred, he was hoping to get his wish. Now, as you can expect, there are many cons to a system like this. There are lots of things that don't work. I'm going to list off a few of them, keeping in mind that there's probably about 10,000 more that I missed. For one, there is absolutely no difference between the number 1 seed and the number 2 seed. The whole point of getting the 1 seed is so that you can have home field advantage throughout the postseason until you get to the Super Bowl. That's gone under this format. You get home field advantage for the divisional round, but that's it. Now, you might say that there's still an incentive to getting the 1 seed because you get to play the wildcard winner in the divisional round, but that's not even true all the time. Remember how in baseball, when they added the wildcard and only had 8 teams in the postseason, how the number 1 seed couldn't play the wildcard winner in the ALDS or the NLDS if they were in the same division? The same format was true in the NFL back in their 10-team postseason of the 1980s. If the wildcard winner came from the same division as the number 1 seed, then the 1 seed would play the 3 seed in the divisional round, and the 2 seed would play the wildcard winner. So if, for example, the Giants got the 1 seed and the Cowboys won the wildcard, the Giants couldn't play the Cowboys in the divisional round. If the 1 seed can't play the wildcard winner, and they can't host the conference championship because it's at a neutral site, there's no advantage at all. If anything, it might be better in some cases to get the 2 seed. There's even an incentive in some cases to be the wildcard instead of the 3 seed. Under the 10-team playoff format, the 2 wildcards would square off against each other in the wildcard round, and then in the divisional round usually the wildcard would play the 1 seed and the 2 seed would play the 3 seed. The 3 seed can't ever host the divisional round. However, if they win their game, and the wildcard wins their game, then the 3 seed can host the conference championship. This scenario actually happened during the 1987-88 postseason. Washington, who later won the Super Bowl that year, was the number 3 seed, and they won their playoff game on the road at Soldier Field against number 2 seeded Chicago. They wound up hosting the NFC Championship because Minnesota, as the number 5 seed, knocked off top-seeded San Francisco. But under this system, if the conference championship was at a neutral site, there's no possible way for the number 3 seed to ever host a playoff game. If you really want the money from hosting a playoff game, it actually might benefit you to be a wildcard and be the number 4 seed so that you get to host a game. It's one of those scenarios to think about that seems insane, but could happen if you had an owner that really wanted money, especially in an era without a salary cap. Thinking about the fans, are fans really going to shell out money to fly to 2 neutral site games so close to each other? Will the stadium for the conference championship sell out if fans decide to keep their money in the hopes of spending it if their team makes it to the Super Bowl? On the other hand, will the stadium for the Super Bowl sell out if fans shell out the money on the conference championships and now don't have enough to go to the Super Bowl? Think of what the stadiums would have looked like in the 21st century with the New England Patriots. From 2001 to 2018, the Patriots made it to 9 Super Bowls and 13 conference championships. Would some of those conference championships have even come close to selling out if they were played at a neutral site across the country? Additionally, if the conference championships are at a neutral site, where do we draw the line? The Super Bowl at a neutral site makes sense. Plenty of championship games all over the world are held at neutral sites. Plus, it's not really fair to compare the records of the AFC teams with the NFC teams and determine it that way, since those teams play completely different schedules with virtually no common opponents. But if you put the conference championship at a neutral site, why not the divisional round? And then, why not the wildcard round? Why not make the entire postseason take place in neutral sites? What makes the conference championship any different from the divisional round or any other round to the point where we should change the conditions of how the game is being played? It opens up a giant can of worms. Sticking with the fans for another point, getting fans to arrange travel plans for the Super Bowl is doable because there's 2 weeks in between the conference championship and the game itself. Plus, the Super Bowl is the end game. That's it. That's the pinnacle right there, and there's nothing after that. But getting fans to arrange travel plans for the conference championship on 1 week's notice, especially when there's the chance that they can play again after that, is much harder. Will there be a bye week between the divisional round of the conference championship to get this done? Then you have tons of issues regarding rust and a postseason that's too long. Again, it's another can of worms that you're opening up if you do this. And plus, there's only a select few cities where the game can even be played, creating a huge advantage for warm weather cities and cities with dome venues. This article and proposal was written in 1982. At the time in the AFC, the only places that would have been able to host conference championship games were Miami, Houston, San Diego, and Seattle. And at the time in the NFC, the only places that would have been able to host a conference championship were Tampa Bay, Detroit, Los Angeles, and New Orleans. That doesn't seem fair to everyone else. As is quite clear, there's a lot that's wrong with playing at a neutral site for the conference championships. It seems like a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad idea where everyone loses in the end. So why did this almost become a thing if everyone thought this was a bad idea? Well, the 2 most powerful men in football didn't seem to think so. Cowboys president Tex Schramm was the head of the competition committee, and he had quite a few reasons for wanting the conference championship to be played at a neutral site, with some of them making more sense than others. Number 1, football was changing. More and more teams were starting to throw the ball, and were centered around heavy pass-oriented offenses. Playing in cold weather was fine before the merger when teams were just running the ball most of the time. But playing in cold weather now puts passing teams at a significant disadvantage. as they're forced to play an entirely different style of football simply because of the temperatures outside. As one writer put it, it was one thing to put Green Bay's plodding champions on a frozen field in the 1960s. It is quite another to cripple the flying circuses of the 1980s. There was also the idea that cold weather games simply did not make for good television, and they don't determine worthy winners. They simply determine which teams can play best in cold weather. Look at the Chargers during that postseason. In the divisional round, they took on the Miami Dolphins in a game widely regarded as one of the greatest playoff games of all time. The epic in Miami was considered by Chargers head coach Don Coryell as the most exciting game in pro football history, and by Dolphins head coach Don Shula as maybe the greatest game ever. It was played under clear skies and 76-degree weather. The following week, the Freezer Bowl. Significantly worse quality. And look at the Browns-Raiders playoff game from a year before where the field was essentially a giant patch of ice, and players were slipping and sliding all over the place. That's not fun to watch, nor does it seem fair. But perhaps the biggest reason has nothing to do with the actual quality of gameplay. It was a money and a safety issue. Prior to the Freezer Bowl, the NFL made sure to consult with the Environmental Research Center to make sure that it was safe to play the game. And apparently, there were 8 NFL cities on that January 10th day where it would have been impossible to play. There were 8 cities that were actually more dangerous than Cincinnati that day from the perspective of being outside and watching a playoff game. And that's saying something, because at the Freezer Bowl, 2 fans were hospitalized. Granted, they were drunk and took their shirts off, but they were still hospitalized. In Cincinnati, if you take out the wind chill, it was negative 9 degrees. In Chicago, meanwhile, it was negative 26 below. Now, I couldn't find any information about wind speeds that day and what the wind chill would have been under the new formula, but under the old formula, which had the Freezer Bowl at negative 59 below, Chicago's wind chill factor was negative 80 degrees. People died that day in Chicago. There were many cities, including Chicago, where people risked permanent health damage if they stayed outside for 30 minutes, let alone an entire 3-hour football game. And 1 week later, on January 17th, the day known as Cold Sunday occurred, where tons of cities, from Green Bay to Washington, D.C., set all-time record low temperatures.
Temperatures dropped to record lows all over the place today. The Midwest, the East, the South. Things will be better tomorrow, but not much.
The NFL postseason was pushed back 1 week for the 1982-83 season. If that pushback was in place for the 1981-82 season, then the games would have fallen on January 17th, Cold Sunday. Tex Schramm realized that this was a problem. The absolutely brutal winter that was January 1982 scared him when it came to playing 3-hour-long football games outdoors. He believed that if one of these cold weather games happened and a fan died because of the weather, that the NFL would be held liable. He said that in today's legal climate, anything is possible, and they might even be successful. Seriously imagine a game played in temperatures 20 degrees colder than the Freezer Bowl if Chicago somehow hosted the NFC Championship that year. It could have been disastrous. He said that we're bound to have a catastrophe or tragedy or disaster eventually if we keep playing these games in January. And there was one other person that, along with Schramm, thought that moving the games to neutral sites was a good idea. Apparently, Commissioner Pete Rozelle liked the idea too. He and Schramm generally saw eye to eye on things, and it seemed like if enough owners were in favor of the change, that Rozelle would be able to convince the others and get this to pass. But this never happened. While support for the proposal grew in wake of the 1981-82 postseason, it was not enough to get this change to occur. Many executives and owners, like NFL Executive Director Don Weiss and Dolphins President Joe Robbie, spoke out against this proposal and shot it down. When it was proposed at the 1982 spring meetings in Arizona, it was rejected. Tex Schramm's pleas were not enough. And to this day, the AFC and the NFC championships are played at the higher seed and not at neutral sites. So will we ever see neutral site conference championships? I highly doubt it. I'm not willing to say never on this idea like I was with the possibility of a best-of-3 Super Bowl, which I made a video on if you want to check that out. If the NFL expands internationally, I could see a feasible scenario where the conference championships are played at neutral locations so that the hassle between traveling across the Atlantic Ocean on such short notice is minimized. But other than that, I'm not sure we'll be seeing neutral site conference championships anytime soon. It's been close to 40 years since this idea last gained serious traction, and I can't see it gaining any traction without any unforeseen developments anytime soon. But it is an interesting thing to think about, even if it's probably never going to happen. How does NFL history change if the conference titles are played at neutral sites? Do the Broncos still beat the Jets in the 1998 AFC Championship if Jason Elam doesn't pull off the greatest mistake in NFL history due to the weather? Does Billy Cundiff miss his field goal in the 2011 AFC Championship if the weather is warmer? Does the outcome of the 2007 NFC Championship in brutally cold conditions between the Giants and the Packers change? These are all interesting hypotheticals that we will never know the answer to. It's hard to imagine the NFL with neutral site conference championships, but this is something that almost happened.